They thought they could take my land. They thought they could control me, break me, but they were wrong. When the HOA sent their lawyers, I sent them a message they'd never forget. The battle for my property wasn't just about fences or rules, it was a war. And this time, I wasn't backing down. Watch as I take on the HOA and expose their darkest secrets. Welcome back to Confessions of HOA. If you're new here, make sure to like and subscribe. I'd been living in peace for years on my 1,200-acre property, a place I could finally call my own. The land had been in the family for generations, and it was everything I dreamed of: wide open spaces, fresh air, a self-sustained life that I'd worked tirelessly to create. My wife and kids were happy, and every morning felt like a fresh start. There was no rushing, no noise, just the hum of nature around us, and the feeling of freedom that only a piece of land this size could give. It was more than just a home. It was a sanctuary, a place we could all escape from the world. But in the distance, the HOA had always been lurking. They weren't a problem at first, just a typical neighborhood organization that liked to keep things orderly. Sure, they sent out newsletters with vague rules and reminders, but they had never really interfered with my life. I was careful to keep my property in line with their odd little codes: colorful flowers in the right spots, grass mowed to their standards, a fence that met their style guide. All the little things. But they had a way of making their presence felt. You know the type. Quietly passive-aggressive, with just enough authority to remind you that they were always watching, always lurking. And for the longest time, I ignored it. Who cared, right? It was just a few letters here and there, a couple of fines for minor infractions, nothing I couldn't handle. But that was about to change. One afternoon, I received a letter that caught me off guard, something about a mandatory inspection of my land. The tone was off, almost like they were staking a claim, trying to worm their way deeper into my life. I could feel it, their growing interest in something much bigger than flower beds and fence height. Something that wasn't mine to give. What did they want with 1,200 acres of land? Why now? And just like that, a quiet tension settled over me, one I hadn't felt before. The calm before the storm was here, but I wasn't going to give in without a fight. Little did I know, the real battle was just about to begin. The knock on the door came earlier than I expected. I wasn't expecting anyone that day, but I opened it to find an unfamiliar man standing on the other side. He wore a stiff suit and a name tag that read, Richard Palmer, HOA representative. His cold smile didn't reach his eyes, and right off the bat, something about the encounter felt off. "I'm here for a routine inspection," he said, his tone polite but firm. "Just to make sure everything's up to code." I hesitated. A routine inspection? The HOA hadn't set foot on my property in years, not since the last time they made some vague request about a mailbox. I had no reason to believe anything had changed. But this felt different. His whole demeanor was different. There was no small talk, no pleasantries, just business. "Sure, come in," I said, stepping aside. He walked through the door like he had been here 100 times before, glancing around as if he already knew what he was looking for. We walked outside, where he immediately started eyeing the edges of my property. The barn, the large oak tree at the corner, the garden that had always been a little wild. He made a few notes in his clipboard, muttering things under his breath about structural compliance and land use. Then, the real fun began. "You know," he said, adjusting his glasses, "this fence, while charming, doesn't really fit the HOA's updated guidelines. It might need to be moved, or even replaced with something more uniform." I froze. The fence has been there for years. "It's fine." He nodded slowly, not listening, as though my opinion didn't matter. "And the garden? Well, we have certain rules about flower arrangements, plant species. I'm sure you'll understand." He didn't wait for me to respond. "I'll be filing a formal request to have these things adjusted." I was getting a sick feeling in my stomach. This wasn't a simple inspection. This wasn't about the trivial things anymore. There was something much bigger brewing, something I hadn't been prepared for. "Well, Richard, I'm not making any promises," I said, keeping my tone even, though the frustration was rising. But as I watched him scribble more notes, I realized this was just the beginning of something far more dangerous. The question was, what was the HOA really after? And how far were they willing to push me to get it? A few days after Richard's visit, the letter arrived. It was thick, official-looking, one of those letters you just know isn't good news. As I tore open the envelope, A wave of disbelief washed over me. Violation of HOA rules. Fines imposed. I scanned the document, trying to process the words. Apparently, my fence didn't meet the HOA's color code standards. The fence I'd built years ago, proud of its rustic charm, was now deemed a violation. I blinked at the fine, $500. $500 for a fence that had never been an issue before, and certainly not an issue to the neighborhood when the house across the street had the same style, with the same color. My heart raced with frustration. This wasn't just about a fence, it was about power. It was their first real move in a game I hadn't agreed to play. I called the number at the bottom of the letter, my hands shaking. A woman named Karen answered, her voice as cold and robotic as the letter itself. "I'm just following the rules, sir," she said without an ounce of empathy. "Your fence doesn't meet the updated code. You'll need to either repaint it or replace it to match the approved palette." I tried to reason with her, explaining that the fence had been standing for over a decade without issue, that it was in line with the aesthetics of the neighborhood. She wasn't having any of it. "It's in the bylaws, and we must enforce these things, regardless of how long it's been," she said, condescending as ever. Her words felt like a slap. It was like she didn't care that I was a homeowner with a family trying to live peacefully. This was petty. This was personal. I hung up the phone, my hands clenched in anger. This wasn't about offense. This was about control. And it wasn't going to end with a simple fine. No, I could feel it. This was just the beginning. It was a Saturday morning when my neighbor, Joe, came over looking nervous. He usually wasn't the type to get involved in neighborhood drama, so when he approached me with a hushed voice, I knew something was wrong. "Hey, you're not going to like this," Joe said, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. I overheard a conversation at the local diner. "The HOA's planning a private meeting next week about your land." I froze. "What do you mean? Why are they talking about my land?" Joe leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just about the fence or the rules. They're trying to figure out what they can do with your property. Apparently, they've been eyeing it for a while. Some of the board members want to develop it, maybe subdivide part of it, maybe impose restrictions to control what you can do. I don't know all the details, but they're making moves." A chill ran down my spine. I'd always known the HOA was a little power-hungry, but this was next level. They weren't just meddling with flower beds or a coat of paint. They were planning to control my land, maybe even take it from me. The thought of them deciding what I could or couldn't do with the property that had been in my family for generations made my blood boil. What are they saying about it? Do they think I'm going to just hand it over? Joe shook his head. They've been talking about rezoning it, maybe using it for something else entirely. But they're being careful. They don't want to make it too obvious. I walked back into the house, feeling a sense of betrayal creeping up my spine. The HOA was no longer just a nuisance. They had their sights set on something much bigger. They were scheming in the shadows, and now I knew it wasn't just about petty fines or rules. The HOA was after my land, and they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. The letters started coming more frequently. At first, it was just the usual complaints: a flower bed slightly off-center, a fence that didn't comply with some new arbitrary rule. But then, the tone began to shift. These weren't just notices anymore, they were threats. One letter mentioned zoning laws, a vague but ominous reference to a reevaluation of land use, implying that my property might not be zoned the way I thought it was. Another warned of escalating fines, suggesting that I'd be taken to court if I didn't comply with their demands. The final paragraph in each letter had the same chilling line: "Failure to comply will result in legal action." I could feel the pressure mounting. The HOA was no longer playing by the rules. It was trying to intimidate me into submission. The relentless barrage of letters felt like a personal attack. They weren't just trying to get me to fix a fence. They were trying to break me, to get me to surrender to their control. And it wasn't just the HOA. It was my neighbors, too. More and more, I found myself receiving icy glares when I passed them in the yard. Conversations turned awkward, and I noticed a few of them looking over their shoulders when they spoke to me. It was like the HOA had cast a shadow over the entire neighborhood, and I was now the enemy. One evening, while I was out walking my dog, I ran into Marissa, who used to be one of my closest neighbors. We'd shared countless cups of coffee and friendly chats on the porch, but now she barely met my eyes. "I heard what's going on," she said, her voice strained, like she was holding something back. "You know, it's better to just comply with them. They're powerful and fighting it. Well, it's just not worth it. Her words felt like a slap, and I knew exactly where they were coming from, right from the HOA playbook. They were trying to isolate me, make me feel like I was on the outside, the one causing trouble. But something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to roll over. The HOA wanted a fight? Fine. They were about to get one. The real battle had just begun. The HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening, and I walked into that room with every intention of handling it with a level head. But as soon as I stepped inside, I could feel the weight of the eyes on me, cold, judgmental, like I was an outsider, an unwelcome element in their little kingdom. The room was filled with the usual faces: the HOA president, Karen, who had already made her intentions clear; the treasurer, a quiet woman named Sandra who always seemed to be looking for a reason to write a fine; and a few other board members who, I soon realized, were just puppets in a bigger game. I didn't have a seat at the table, but I was prepared to stand my ground. I raised my hand and calmly addressed the room. I'm here to understand why my land is being targeted. Why are you suddenly so interested in my property? Karen, with her fake smile and tight grip on the gavel, immediately cut in. You've been causing a lot of disruptions, Mr. Your name. Your disregard for our rules affects the entire neighborhood. Maybe it's time we all have a conversation about your lifestyle choices and how they reflect on the community. I blinked, taken aback by the directness of her words. What are you talking about? I demanded, my voice growing more frustrated. Let's not pretend we don't see it, she continued, her voice dripping with condescension. Your property, your lifestyle, it's different. It stands out in a way that's unsettling for some of the other residents. You've chosen to live outside of what we consider normal. The overgrown fields, the self-sustained lifestyle, it's a little too unconventional for this neighborhood. You're not exactly fitting in. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd always prided myself on my independence, my ability to live off the land. But in that moment, it felt like my entire way of life was being attacked, judged as inferior, even wrong. The more they spoke, the more I realized this wasn't about a fence or zoning laws anymore. They were going after me, personally. They wanted control, and they were willing to destroy everything I'd worked for to get it. I stood there, fists clenched, heart pounding. It was clear now. They weren't going to stop until they crushed me, until they had complete control. And I was done. Done playing nice. It was time to fight back, no matter the cost. It started with a letter, of course. A legal one this time. The HOA had hired an attorney, and they weren't wasting any time. The letter was full of legal jargon I barely understood, but the message was clear: comply with their demands, or they would take me to court. The fines were mounting, the threats more serious, and the intensity behind the words couldn't be ignored. They were no longer playing petty games. This was a full-on legal attack. I could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on me. They were pushing, testing how far I would go to protect my land. But I wasn't going to bend. So, I hired my own lawyer, a local attorney who'd handled property disputes before, and prepared for a battle I never thought I'd have to fight. But as the days went on, I started hearing things. Neighbors who had once been cordial were now avoiding me, their faces masked with nervous smiles. Some even whispered about their own HOA battles, about how they'd been advised to comply or face similar consequences. It wasn't until I caught an offhand conversation at the corner store that the full picture started to emerge. The HOA wasn't just bullying me. They'd been manipulating others too, using legal threats, fines, and their control over the neighborhood to bend people to their will. I learned that the HOA had been pushing for things like easements on properties, demanding residents pay fines for things that weren't even violations. They'd been making deals behind closed doors, forcing people to voluntarily sell their land under the guise of neighborhood improvement. It was more than just a homeowners association. It was like a criminal organization, using intimidation and threats to get whatever they wanted. They were playing dirty, and I knew it was only going to get worse. But this wasn't the time to back down. I'd been fighting for what was mine, but now, I realized this wasn't just about me. It was about the entire neighborhood. And if the HOA was really operating like a mafia, I had to be ready for the war that was coming. This battle wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. The turning point came when I least expected it, when the last thing I wanted was for someone to notice me or speak out on my behalf. But that's exactly what happened. It started with Sarah, a woman I barely knew, but one I'd always seen walking her dog in the mornings. She came over one evening, her eyes wide with a mix of concern and determination. "I've been watching what's happening," she said quietly, glancing over her shoulder before sitting down on my porch. "And I think it's time we do something about it. I'm not the only one who feels this way." It was like a switch had flipped. Sarah wasn't the only one. Over the next few days, a steady stream of neighbors came forward, one by one, pulling me aside to share their own experiences with the HOA. Some had been hit with ridiculous fines for things like yard maintenance and violations of aesthetic guidelines that were never enforced until now. Others had been threatened with lawsuits, forced to make unnecessary changes, or bullied into agreeing to decisions they never wanted to make. What surprised me was how many of them had been living in fear. They had all quietly put up with the HOA's oppressive tactics, afraid to speak out or get involved. But hearing my story, seeing my resistance, they began to see that they weren't alone anymore. They didn't have to be silent. Together, we started to form a plan. I wasn't going to fight this alone anymore. We would get legal representation, not just for me, but for the whole neighborhood. We would gather evidence, file complaints, and make the HOA's abuses public. We started meeting secretly, planning our strategy, and spreading the word to other neighbors who were still intimidated. We were going to fight back, and we weren't going to stop until the HOA was held accountable. As I stood in my yard, looking at my neighbors, people who had been so quiet for so long, I finally felt it. The weight of the battle was still heavy, but now, it wasn't just my fight. The entire neighborhood was behind me, ready to take action. And for the first time in this whole ordeal, I felt like we had a real chance of winning. The day of the public meeting arrived, and it felt like the air itself was charged with tension. The room was packed with people from the neighborhood, many of whom I hadn't seen before, but all of whom had been silently watching the HOA's manipulation unfold. We had gathered every piece of evidence we could find: letters, fines, recordings of conversations, even testimonies from other residents who had been too afraid to speak up before. We were ready. Karen sat at the front with her usual smug expression, flanked by the board members who had made life difficult for so many of us. She wasted no time, starting with her usual spiel about maintaining community standards and upholding the values of the neighborhood. But this time, I wasn't about to let her slide by with her hollow words. When it was my turn to speak, the room fell silent. I began with a calm but firm tone, laying out exactly what the HOA had been doing: the constant threats, the bullying tactics, the personal attacks. But I didn't stop there. I had something they didn't expect, a key piece of evidence that would blow their manipulation wide open. With a steady hand, I slid a document across the table. It was a recording, one of the HOA board members, caught on tape, talking about how they were planning to force me to sell my property. It was clear. They'd been plotting behind the scenes to take control of my land, to force me into submission through legal pressure and fear. The room gasped. For a moment, Karen's confident facade cracked. The other board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I could feel the tide turning in that moment. The neighbors who had been unsure, those who had stayed silent in fear, now had proof. The HOA's mask was slipping, and their true intentions were on full display. But Karen wasn't ready to back down yet. She tried to salvage the situation, throwing out legal jargon and clinging to her position, but it was too late. The damage was done. The room was on our side now. It wasn't just a fight for my property anymore. It was about exposing the HOA for what they truly were: manipulators, power-hungry, and deceitful. But as the tension grew, I knew we weren't done yet. The final moment of justice was coming, and it would be sweeter than anything I'd ever imagined. The moment of victory came like a wave crashing down, sudden, overwhelming, and utterly satisfying. After weeks of heated arguments, secret meetings, and the constant pressure from the HOA, it was finally over. The community rallied behind me, and the votes were counted. The HOA was voted out. The board members, including Karen, were removed from power, their grip on the neighborhood shattered. The weight that had been pressing down on me for months lifted in an instant. I'd won not just for myself, but for every neighbor who had ever been silenced by fear. The HOA's plans to control my land were abandoned, and they were no longer a threat. The community was free from their rule, and I had reclaimed control over my property. But the real poetic justice came soon after. Karen, the HOA president who had been the driving force behind the entire ordeal, was caught in her own web of lies. It was a simple mistake, She'd made a false statement in an official meeting, something minor that seemed to go unnoticed at the time. But when it was exposed, her credibility crumbled. Neighbors who had once been afraid to speak up now openly criticized her, and her reputation in the community was destroyed. It felt like the universe had finally balanced the scales. The woman who had tried to control my life had now lost everything she'd worked so hard to build. As I walked through my land, the place that had been the center of all the tension, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. I'd stood my ground, fought back against the odds, and won. This wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for everyone who had ever felt powerless. If you've ever been pushed to the edge by an HOA, or if you're ready to take back control, remember this: you don't have to fight alone. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Confessions of HOA for more stories about standing up to the system, exposing the truth, and fighting for what's yours. Share your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear your stories.